Hello, everybody, and welcome to another lesson from the animal behavior course. Today, we're going to be going over phylogenetic trees, just a really quick, brief video to give everybody sort of a refresher on how phylogenetic trees work, and because they can be kind of confusing when you look at them for the first time. So we're going to just go over kind of a couple examples and hopefully get out of here really quickly with a nice short lesson. So phylogenetic trees. Evolutionary biologists and animal behavior scientists use these a lot. This is an example of a phylogenetic tree, for example, of cat species. It's kind of like a family tree, but it consists over millions and millions of years, and it sort of looks at the evolution of different related species. They start sort of, if you start on this right side, these are all of the animals that are existing or alive today, right? You have lions, leopards, tigers, and even sort of the domestic cat, right? These are all related to in some way. As you move from right to left, which I know is kind of counterintuitive, you go backwards in evolutionary time. So as if you were reading a book left to right, you start with sort of what happened in the beginning of the book and you end with what happens in the end of the book, right? So from left to right, you're going forward in time, but usually we're kind of looking at what exists today and going back in time as scientists. Now, I'm going to highlight a couple different sort of key points in the tree. That orange dot. So let's look at the orange dot first. The orange dot is the ancestor of lions and leopards, but not the common ancestor of tigers. In order to look at the common ancestor of tigers, lions, and leopards, we would need to move further back in evolutionary time to that blue dot. The red dot is the common ancestor of all of the cat species, because they all branch off from that single point. So many millions or maybe even billions of years ago, there was a common ancestor that led to all of these different species. And so some trees, although this is not always the case, some trees will have this pink dot on them. And these pink dots represent species that went extinct a long time ago. So for example, if you've ever seen Ice Age, Diego's a saber-toothed tiger. And so maybe a saber-toothed tiger would appear on the pink dot here on the thing, where we don't have saber-toothed tigers anymore, but they did exist at one point. And so just a couple sort of things, if I were to ask you questions about a phylogenetic tree, we can talk about sort of the relatedness of species. So for example, lions are most closely related to leopards. Tigers are closely related to leopards and lions, but the amount of relatedness is equal. So this is often a common misconception, right? So people will say, okay, tigers and leopards are more closely related because their names are closer to each other on the tree. But the reality is you can actually rotate this tree around. And really what matters is that most common ancestor. So in this case, that blue dot. Right, and so that blue dot is the common ancestor between lions, leopards, and tigers, and it existed equal distance from tigers to leopards as it did from tigers to lions, right? So the same, we'll just say 20 million years, I don't actually know the number, the same amount of time existed between tigers and leopards as it did between tigers and lions. And so that's a really sort of common misunderstanding with these trees, is that just because a name is closer in writing doesn't mean that they're more closely related. You have to go back in time to a recent common ancestor. And then lastly, what we can tell about domesticated cats is that they're related to all of them, but they're much more distantly related. So they go all the way back to the red dot. Now, these different trees, there's sort of a lot of different things that can come about these trees. It might be easier to look at sort of a primate tree because we have maybe a better understanding of how we relate to other animals. So, for example, if you look at this tree here, you can see that humans are most closely related to chimpanzees and bonobos. Once again, see, our name is written really close to chimpanzees, but it's equally in terms of distance, it's equally as close as it is to bonobos. And so the two species, chimpanzees and bonobos, they're two ape species that look very, very similar, but they are different. and we'll go over differences later on in this class. We are equally as related to both of those species. And we know that because our common ancestor came off of that branch point at about that pink dot. Now, compared to, say, gorillas, our common ancestor is a little bit further back for gorillas, so therefore we are more related to chimps and bonobos than we are to gorillas. And so that's a way to sort of read these different phylogenetic trees, and they can contain different kinds of information, but this is sort of typically the way that you will see them. Okay, cool. So that's what we do. As animal behaviorists studying evolution, we take animal models and we ask questions about their behavior. We can then construct these kind of trees to answer ultimate questions about when, how, and why did such a behavior evolve. So this is going to be like a ridiculous example, but I want to show you how an animal behaviorist might construct one of these trees. So let's imagine that you've just turned on Netflix and you sit there unable to decide what in the world you want to watch. We'll call this behavior Netflix indecisiveness. We all have it, humans have it, and we want to find when this Netflix indecisiveness evolved. Well, we know that it's something that happens in humans. Great. So we can go ahead and put a check mark by humans and mark them as green. And boom, just like that, we run a study, and all of a sudden we test it in chimpanzees, we give them Netflix, and they also take a very, very long time to decide what in the world they want to watch. And then we can also do the same thing to, say, marmosets. They also seem to have this Netflix indecisiveness. But then when we test out the bush baby, they choose a show almost immediately. So they do not show evidence of this Netflix indecisiveness. So if you're building a phylogenetic tree and you wanted to best predict where this Netflix indecisiveness evolved, then which dot would you say that the behavior evolved? You got 1, 2, 3, or 4. Where's the most likely position for Netflix indecisiveness to have evolved, given what we see here on the different primates and their different abilities to have this? I'll give you guys a couple seconds to think about it. If you need some more time, pause it. This is a really great question that I want you guys to know. Awesome. If you chose number 3, you would be correct, because it makes the most sense that it would have evolved right before the branch of marmosets and all the other species. And since bush babies are much better at choosing Netflix shows than us, it likely evolved at some point after their common ancestor, right? So if Netflix indecisiveness occurred in number 4, we would expect the bush babies or the galagos to have Netflix indecisiveness, but they do not, right? And so this is a ridiculous example about Netflix indecisiveness, but it shows you how, as animal behaviorists, we can look at how behavior evolved across species and maybe begin to understand when or why a behavior came to be. But as you can imagine, it does get a lot more complex than that. For example, sometimes we don't have all the information. As animal behaviors, sometimes there are species that we just don't have access to, species that we cannot test. And so sometimes we're left with question marks. And so if you're given something like this, where you have it in humans and in marmosets, but you don't have it in bush babies, and you're not sure about chimpanzees or baboons or macaques, it's really hard to kind of draw a conclusion, right? And sometimes we have results that show a behavior in animals, but not all animals, right? And so indicating that the behavior may have evolved more than once throughout evolutionary history. Or maybe it evolved and then de-evolved as it was not advantageous for certain species. And so I'm not going to get sort of into too much of the different possibilities here, but I wanted you to know that as animal behaviorists, it's our job to test animal behavior and to look across these phylogenetic trees and understand maybe when or why or how behavior evolved based on what we found. And so this is sort of just a really quick example showing that. And so I do want to kind of highlight just a couple little bits of terminology here before you go, just because I think they're important to know when we're talking about animals in general. Homology is going to be the first term we talk about. And this is a trait that's shared by 2 or more species due to a common ancestor. For example, all female mammals produce milk for their offspring, and this is because all mammals share a common ancestor that also produced milk. Or, for example, the bones in a mammalian hand are all similar, even though some mammals grab things, some use them to run, some use them to swim, some use them to fly, right? They all evolved from a common ancestor that had those same bone structures. And so that is an example of a homology. And so the creation of homology is the result of what is known as divergent evolution. It happens when related species accumulate differences over time, adapting them to different environments. And so, right, a dolphin and the common ancestor between a dolphin and humans likely had those similar bone structures, but they experienced divergent evolution to create this homology. The dolphins lived in an environment that was underwater, and so it made more sense for them to use those bones to swim. And humans evolved in an environment where they were above water and needed to grab things and forage, so they evolved those bones to use them for grabbing things. This is in contrast to what is known as a homoplasy, which is a trait that's shared between two or more species, but not because they shared a common ancestor, but instead because natural selection has acted independently on each species. So, for example, if we look at the wings of birds and the mammals that have wings like bats and the wings of insects, they all have wings. They're similar in construction, but they don't share a common ancestor with wings. Instead, it's because natural selection put pressure on these species to develop an ability to fly, and so they have an appendage that is associated with flight, even though they may not have sort of the same common ancestor. And so the shared natural selection pressure is referred to sort of an analogy or an analogous structure, and it leads to the production of analogous traits. Another example are sharks, penguins, and dolphins, right? They share a very, very distant common ancestor. But the common ancestor did not necessarily have the same kinds of fins. Dolphins developed flippers because it was advantageous to be able to use them in water. Penguins have wings that can't fly but can help them swim, not because it was from a common ancestor with dolphins, but because it was advantageous for them to be able to swim. And similarly with sharks, which are a type of fish, they did not have this development because they shared a common ancestor with penguins or with dolphins that also had a fin, but instead they had it because it was advantageous for their through their evolutionary trajectory to be able to have fins that help them propel them in water. Now, these analogous structures are created through what's known as convergent evolution. Convergent evolution occurs when unrelated species evolve similar traits independently, often because they're facing very similar environmental pressures. In the example here on the screen, the environmental pressure is living underwater. And so we ideally, when we're constructing phylogenetic trees, we try to include homologies, but eliminate sort of these analogous structures. So that's sort of an idea of trying to sort of parse these differences apart when building phylogenetic trees. And so just real quick, here's an overview of the things that's not over here. So just yeah, so I hope that those examples and those terminology are really helpful in helping you to construct phylogenetic trees. This is actually the overview of the next of the previous lesson. But yeah, just we can go over that real quick. The things we talked about in the previous lesson involve adaptation and exaptation, as well as vestigial structures and genetic drift. And also in today's lesson, we talked a lot about phylogeny, specifically homologies, convergent evolution, and divergent evolution. And so the password for the quiz is animal, all lowercase. And so I hope that was helpful, and I look forward to the next lesson.